Welcome back to the Goddess of Mystery and Mayhem. I will be bringing different topics to my channel to bring a variety of topics here. If there is a certain story you like me to do for any of you, put it in the comments and I will do it. Okay, let's begin our story. Harriet Tubman, born Araminta Ross, c. March 1822 March 10, 1913, was an American abolitionist and social activist. After escaping slavery, Tubman made some 13 missions to rescue approximately 70 enslaved people, including her family and friends, using the network of anti-slavery activists and safe houses known collectively as the Underground Railroad. During the American Civil War, she served as an armed scout and spy for the Union Army. In her later years, Tubman was an activist in the movement for women's suffrage. Born into slavery in Dorchester County, Maryland, Tubman was beaten and whipped by various enslavers as a child. Early in life, she suffered a traumatic head wound when an irate overseer threw a heavy metal weight, intending to hit another slave, but hit her instead. The injury caused dizziness, pain, and spells of hypersomnia, which occurred throughout her life. After her injury, Tubman began experiencing strange visions and vivid dreams, which she ascribed to premonitions from God. These experiences, combined with her Methodist upbringing, led her to become devoutly religious. In 1849, Tubman escaped to Philadelphia, only to return to Maryland to rescue her family soon after. Slowly, one group at a time, she brought relatives with her out of the state, and eventually guided dozens of other enslaved people to freedom. Traveling by night and in extreme secrecy, Tubman, or Moses, as she was called, never lost a passenger. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, she helped guide escapees farther north into British North America and Canada and helped newly freed people find work. Tubman met John Brown in 1858 and helped him plan and recruit supporters for his 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry plantation. They married around 1808 and, according to court records, had 9 children together: Lina, Maria Ritty, Soph, Robert, Minty, Harriet, Ben, Rachel, Henry, and Moses. Rit struggled to keep her family together as slavery threatened to tear it apart. Edward Brodess sold 3 of her daughters, Lina, Maria Ritty, and Soph, separating them from the family forever. When a trader from Georgia approached Brodess about buying Rit's youngest son, Moses, she hid him for a month, aided by other enslaved people and freedmen in the community. At one point she confronted Brodess about the sale. Finally, Brodess and the Georgia man came toward the slave quarters to seize the child. Where Rit told them, "You are after my son, but the first man that comes into my house, I will split his head open." Brodess backed away and abandoned the sale. Tubman's biographers agree that stories told about this event within the family influenced her belief in the possibilities of resistance. Tubman's mother was assigned to the big house and had scarce time for her own family. Consequently, as a child, Tubman took care of a younger brother and baby, as was typical in large families. When she was 5 or 6 years old, Brodess hired her out as a nursemaid to a woman named Miss Susan. Tubman was ordered to care for the baby and rock the cradle as it slept. When the baby woke up and cried, Tubman was whipped. She later recounted a particular day when she was lashed 5 times before breakfast. She carried the scars for the rest of her life. She found ways to resist, such as running away for 5 days, wearing layers of clothing as protection against beatings, and fighting back. Also in her childhood, Tubman was sent to work for a planter named James Cook. She had to check his muskrat traps in nearby marshes, even after contracting measles. She became so ill that Cook sent her back to Brodess, where her mother nursed her back to health. Brodess then hired her out again. She spoke later of her acute childhood homesickness, comparing herself to the boy on the Swanee River, an allusion to Stephen Foster's song, Old Folks at Home. As she grew older and stronger, she was assigned to field and forest work, driving oxen, plowing, and hauling logs. As an adolescent, Tubman suffered a severe head injury when an overseer threw a 2-pound, 1-kilogram, metal weight at another slave who was attempting to flee. The weight struck Tubman instead, which she said, broke my skull. Bleeding and unconscious, she was returned to her enslaver's house and laid on the seat of a loom, where she remained without medical care for 2 days. After this incident, Tubman frequently experienced extremely painful headaches. She also began having seizures and would seemingly fall unconscious, although she claimed to be aware of her surroundings while appearing to be asleep. Larson suggests she may have had temporal lobe epilepsy as a result of the injury. Clinton suggests her condition may have been narcolepsy or cataplexy. A definitive diagnosis is not possible due to lack of contemporary medical evidence, but this condition remained with her for the rest of her life. After her injury, Tubman began experiencing visions and vivid dreams, which she interpreted as revelations from God. These spiritual experiences had a profound effect on Tubman's personality, and she acquired a passionate faith in God. Although Tubman was illiterate, she was told Bible stories by her mother and likely attended a Methodist church with her family. She rejected the teachings of white preachers who urged enslaved people to be passive and obedient victims to those who trafficked and enslaved them. Instead, she found guidance in the Old Testament tales of deliverance. This religious perspective informed her actions throughout her life. Anthony Thompson promised to manumit Tubman's father at age 45. After Thompson died, his son followed through with that promise in 1840. Tubman's father. In 1849, Tubman became ill again, which diminished her value to slave traders. Edward Brodess tried to sell her, but could not find a buyer. Angry at him for trying to sell her and for continuing to enslave her relatives, Tubman began to pray for God to make Brodess change his ways. She said later, "I prayed all night long for my master till the 1st of March, and all the time he was bringing people to look at me, and trying to sell me. When it appeared as though a sale was being concluded, Tubman changed her prayer. 1st of March I began to pray, 'Oh Lord, if you ain't never going to change that man's heart, kill him, Lord, and take him out of the way.' A week later, Brodess died. And Tubman expressed regret for her earlier sentiments. In many estate settlements, Brodess's death increased the likelihood that Tubman would be sold and her family broken apart. His widow, Eliza, began working to sell the family's enslaved people. Tubman refused to wait for the Brodess family to decide her fate, despite her husband's efforts to dissuade her. Here was one of 2 things I had a right to, she explained later, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. Tubman and her brothers, Ben and Henry, escaped from slavery on September 17, 1849. Tubman had been hired out to Anthony Thompson, the son of her father's former owner, who owned a large plantation in an area called Poplar Neck in neighboring Caroline County. It is likely her brothers labored for Thompson as well. Because they were hired out, Eliza Brodess probably did not recognize their absence as an escape attempt for some time. 2 weeks later, she posted a runaway notice in the Cambridge Democrat, offering a reward of up to $100 each, equivalent to $3,520 in 2022, for their capture and return to slavery. Once they had left, Tubman's brothers had second thoughts. Ben may have regretted leaving his wife and children. The 2 men went back, forcing Tubman to return with them. Sometime in October or November, Tubman escaped again, this time without her brothers. Before leaving, she sang a farewell song to hint at her intentions, which she hoped would be understood by Mary, a trusted fellow slave. "I'll meet you in the morning," she intoned, "I'm bound for the promised land." While her exact route is unknown, Tubman made use of the network known as the Underground Railroad. This informal system was composed of free and enslaved black people, white abolitionists, and other activists. Most prominent among the latter in Maryland at the time were Quakers, members of the Religious Society of Friends. The Preston area near Poplar Neck contained a substantial Quaker community and was probably an important first stop during Tubman's escape. From there, she probably took a common route for people fleeing slavery, northeast along the Choptank River, through Delaware, and then north into Pennsylvania. A journey of nearly 90 miles, 145 kilometers, by foot would have taken between 5 days and 3 weeks. Tubman had to travel by night, guided by the North Star and trying to avoid slave catchers eager to collect rewards for fugitive slaves. The conductors in the Underground Railroad used deceptions for protection. At an early stop, the lady of the house instructed Tubman to sweep the yard so as to seem to be working for the family. When night fell, the family hid her in a cart and took her to the next friendly house. Given her familiarity with the woods and marshes of the region, Tubman likely hid in these locales during the day. The particulars of her first journey are unknown. Because other escapees from slavery used the routes, Tubman did not discuss them until later in life. She crossed into Pennsylvania with a feeling of relief and awe, and recalled the experience years later. When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees, and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. After reaching Philadelphia, Tubman thought of her family. I was a stranger in a strange land, she said later. My father, my mother, my brothers, and sisters, and friends were in Maryland. But I was free, and they should be free. While Tubman saved money from working odd jobs in Philadelphia and Cape May, New Jersey, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which forced law enforcement officials to assist in the capture of escaped slaves, even in states that had outlawed slavery, and heavily punished abetting escape. The law increased risks for those who had escaped slavery, more of whom therefore sought refuge in southern Ontario, where slavery had been abolished. Racial tensions were also increasing in Philadelphia as poor Irish immigrants competed with free blacks for work. In December 1850, Tubman was warned that her niece Keziah and Keziah's children would soon be sold in Cambridge. Tubman went to Baltimore, where her brother-in-law Tom Tubman hid her until the sale. Keziah's husband, a free black man named John Bowley, made the winning bid for his wife. While the auctioneer stepped away to have lunch, John, Keziah, and their children escaped to a nearby safe house. When night fell, Bowley sailed the family on a log canoe 60 miles, 97 kilometers, to Baltimore, where they met with Tubman, who brought the family to Philadelphia. Early next year she returned to Maryland to guide away other family members. During her second trip, she recovered her youngest brother, Moses, along with 2 other men. Word of her exploits had encouraged her family, and she became more confident with each trip to Maryland. In late 1851, Tubman returned to Dorchester County for the first time since her escape, this time to find her husband John. When she arrived there, she learned that John had married another woman named Caroline. Tubman sent word that he should join her, but he insisted that he was happy where he was. Suppressing her anger, she found some enslaved people who wanted to escape and led them to Philadelphia. Because the fugitive slave law had made the northern United States a more dangerous place for those escaping slavery to remain, many escapees began migrating to southern Ontario. In December 1851, Tubman guided an unidentified group of 11 escapees, possibly including the Bowleys and several others she had helped rescue earlier, northward. There is evidence to suggest that Tubman and her group stopped at the home of abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass. Douglass and Tubman admired one another greatly as they both struggled against slavery. Years later he contrasted his efforts with hers. Writing, "Most that I have done and suffered in the service of our cause has been in public, and I have received much encouragement at every step of the way. You, on the other hand, have labored in a private way. I have wrought in the day, you in the night. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism. Excepting John Brown, of sacred memory, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have. From 1851 to 1862, Tubman returned repeatedly to the eastern shore of Maryland, rescuing some 70 slaves in about 13 expeditions, including her other brothers, Henry, Ben, and Robert, their wives and some of their children. She also provided specific instructions to 50 to 60 additional enslaved people who escaped. Because of her efforts, she was nicknamed Moses, alluding to the biblical prophet who led the Hebrews to freedom from Egypt. One of her last missions into Maryland was to retrieve her aging parents. Her father purchased her mother from Eliza Brodess in 1855, but even when they were both free, the area was hostile. In 1857, Tubman received word that her father was at risk of arrest for harboring a group of 8 people escaping slavery. She led her parents north to St. Catharines, Ontario, where a community of former enslaved people, including other relatives and friends of Tubman, had gathered. Tubman's dangerous work required ingenuity. She usually worked during winter, when long nights and cold weather minimized the chance of being seen. She would start the escapes on Saturday evenings, since newspapers would not print runaway notices until Monday morning. She used subterfuges to avoid detection. Tubman once disguised herself with a bonnet and carried 2 live chickens to give the appearance of running errands. Suddenly finding herself walking toward a former enslaver, she yanked the strings holding the bird's legs. And their agitation allowed her to avoid eye contact. Later she recognized a fellow train passenger as a former enslaver. She snatched a nearby newspaper and pretended to read. Tubman was known to be illiterate, and the man ignored her. In an 1897 interview with historian Wilbur Siebert, Tubman named some people who helped her and places she stayed along the Underground Railroad. She stayed with Sam Green, a free black minister living in East New Market, Maryland. She also hid near her parents' home at Poplar Neck. She would travel from there northeast to Sandtown and Willow Grove, Delaware, and to the Camden area where free black agents, William and Nat Brinkley and Abraham Gibbs, guided her north past Dover, Smyrna, and Blackbird, where other agents would take her across the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal to Newcastle and Wilmington. In Wilmington, Quaker Thomas Garrett would secure transportation to William Still's office or the homes of other Underground Railroad operators in the greater Philadelphia area. Still is credited with helping hundreds escape to safer places in New York, New England, and southern Ontario. Tubman's faith was another important resource as she ventured repeatedly into Maryland. The visions from her childhood head injury continued, and she saw them as divine premonitions. She spoke of consulting with God, and trusted that He would keep her safe. Garrett once said of her, "I never met with any person of any color who had more confidence in the voice of God, as spoken direct to her soul." Her faith also provided immediate assistance. She used spirituals as coded messages, warning fellow travelers of danger or to signal a clear path. She sang versions of "Go Down Moses," and changed the lyrics to indicate that it was either safe or too dangerous to proceed. As she led escapees across the border, she would call out, "Glory to God and Jesus, too. One more soul is safe." She carried a revolver as protection from slave catchers and their dogs. Tubman also threatened to shoot anyone who tried to turn back, since that would risk the safety of the remaining group, as well as anyone who helped them on the way. Tubman spoke of one man who insisted he was going to go back to the plantation. She pointed the gun at his head and said, "Go on or die." Several days later, the man who wavered crossed into Canada with the rest of the group. By the late 1850s, Eastern Shore slaveholders were holding public meetings about the large number of escapes in the area. They cast suspicion on free blacks and white abolitionists. They did not know that Minty, the petite, disabled woman who had run away years before, was responsible for freeing so many enslaved people. Though a popular legend persists about a reward of $40,000, equivalent to $1,303,000 in 2022, for Tubman's capture. This is a manufactured figure. In 1867, in support of Tubman's claim for a military pension, an abolitionist named Sally Hawley wrote that $40,000 was not too great a reward for Maryland slaveholders to offer for her. If it were real, such a high reward would have garnered national attention. A reward of $12,000 has also been claimed, though no documentation has been found for either figure. Tubman and the fugitives she assisted were never captured. Years later, she told an audience, "I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger." In April 1858, Tubman was introduced to the abolitionist John Brown, an insurgent who advocated the use of violence to destroy slavery in the United States. Although she was not previously involved in armed insurrection, she agreed with his course of direct action and supported his goals. Like Tubman, he spoke of being called by God, and trusted the divine to protect him from the wrath of slavers. She, meanwhile, claimed to have had a prophetic vision of meeting Brown before their encounter. Thus, as he began recruiting supporters for an attack on slaveholders, Brown was joined by General Tubman, as he called her. Her knowledge of support networks and resources in the border states of Pennsylvania, Maryland and Delaware was invaluable to Brown and his planners. Although other abolitionists like Douglas did not endorse his tactics, Brown dreamed of fighting to create a new state for those freed from slavery, and made preparations for military action. He believed that after he began the first battle, the enslaved would rise up and carry out a rebellion across the slave states. He asked Tubman to gather former slaves then living in southern Ontario who might be willing to join his fighting force. Which she did. On May 8, 1858, Brown held a meeting in Chatham, Ontario, where he unveiled his plan for a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. When word of the plan was leaked to the government, Brown put the scheme on hold and began raising funds for its eventual resumption. Tubman aided him in this effort, and with more detailed plans for the assault. Tubman was busy during this time, giving talks to abolitionist audiences and tending to her relatives. In early October 1859, as Brown and his men prepared to launch the attack, Tubman was ill in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Years later, she told an audience, "I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger." In April 1858, Tubman was introduced to the abolitionist John Brown, an insurgent who advocated the use of violence to destroy slavery in the United States. Although she was not previously involved in armed insurrection, she agreed with his course of direct action and supported his goals. Like Tubman, he spoke of being called by God, and trusted the divine to protect him from the wrath of slavers. She, meanwhile, claimed to have had a prophetic vision of meeting Brown before their encounter. Thus, as he began recruiting supporters for an attack on slaveholders, Brown was joined by General Tubman, as he called her. Her knowledge of support networks and resources in the border states of Pennsylvania, Maryland and Delaware was invaluable to Brown and his planners. Although other abolitionists like Douglas did not endorse his tactics, Brown dreamed of fighting to create a new state for those freed from slavery, and made preparations for military action. He believed that after he began the first battle, the enslaved would rise up and carry out a rebellion across the slave states. He asked Tubman to gather former slaves then living in southern Ontario who might be willing to join his fighting force. Which she did. On May 8, 1858, Brown held a meeting in Chatham, Ontario, where he unveiled his plan for a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. When word of the plan was leaked to the government, Brown put the scheme on hold and began raising funds for its eventual resumption. Tubman aided him in this effort, and with more detailed plans for the assault. Tubman was busy during this time, giving talks to abolitionist audiences and tending to her relatives. In early October 1859, as Brown and his men prepared to launch the attack, Tubman was ill in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It is not known whether she still intended to join Brown's raid or if she had become skeptical of the plan, but when the raid on Harper's Ferry took place on October 16, Tubman had recovered from her illness and was in New York City. The raid failed. Brown was convicted of treason, murder, and inciting a rebellion, and he was hanged on December 2. His actions were seen by many abolitionists as a symbol of proud resistance, carried out by a noble martyr. Tubman herself was effusive with praise. She later told a friend, "He done more in dying than 100 men would in living." In early 1859, Frances Adeline Seward, the wife of abolitionist Republican U.S. Senator William H. Seward, sold Tubman a 7-acre, 2.8 hectares, farm in Fleming, New York, for $1,200, equivalent to $42,200 in 2022. The adjacent city of Auburn was a hotbed of anti-slavery activism, and Tubman took the opportunity to move her parents from Canada back to the U.S. Her farmstead became a haven for Tubman's family and friends. For years, she took in relatives and boarders, offering a safe place for Black Americans seeking a better life in the North. Shortly after acquiring the farm, Tubman went back to Maryland and returned with an 8-year-old light-skinned black girl named Margaret, who Tubman said was her niece. She also indicated the girl's parents were free blacks. According to Margaret's daughter Alice, Margaret later described her childhood home as prosperous and said that she left behind a twin brother. These descriptions conflict with what is known about the families of Tubman's siblings, which created uncertainty among historians about the relationship and Tubman's motivations. Alice called Tubman's actions a kidnapping, saying she had taken the child from a sheltered good home to a place where there was nobody to care for her. After speculating in her 2004 biography of Tubman that Margaret might have been Tubman's own secret daughter, Kate Larson found evidence that Margaret was the daughter of Isaac and Mary Wolford, a free black couple who were neighbors of Tubman's parents in Maryland and who had twins named James and Margaret. In November 1860, Tubman conducted her last rescue mission. Throughout the 1850s, Tubman had been unable to effect the escape of her sister Rachel, and Rachel's 2 children Ben and Angerine. Upon returning to Dorchester County, Tubman discovered that Rachel had died, and the children could be rescued only if she could pay a bribe of $30, equivalent to $980 in 2022. She did not have the money, so the children remained enslaved. Their fates remain unknown. Never one to waste a trip, Tubman gathered another group, including the Ennals family, ready and willing to take the risks of the journey north. It took them weeks to get away safely because of slave catchers forcing them to hide out longer than expected. The weather was unseasonably cold and they had little food. The Ennals' infant child was quieted with paregoric while slave patrols rode by. They safely reached the home of David and Martha Wright in Auburn on December 28, 1860. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Tubman saw a Union victory as a key step toward the abolition of slavery. General Benjamin Butler, for instance, aided escapees flooding into Fort Monroe in Virginia. Butler had declared these fugitives to be contraband, property seized by Northern forces, and put them to work, initially without pay, in the fort. Tubman hoped to offer her own expertise and skills to the Union cause, too, and soon she joined a group of Boston and Philadelphia abolitionists heading to the Hilton Head district in South Carolina. She became a fixture in the camps, particularly in Port Royal, South Carolina. Assisting fugitives, Tubman met with General David Hunter, a strong supporter of abolition. He declared all of the contrabands in the Port Royal district free, and began gathering formerly enslaved people for a regiment of black soldiers. U.S. President Abraham Lincoln, however, was not yet prepared to enforce emancipation on the Southern states, and reprimanded Hunter for his actions. Tubman condemned Lincoln's response and his general unwillingness to consider ending slavery in the U.S., for both moral and practical reasons. God won't let Master Lincoln beat the South till he does the right thing. Master Lincoln, he's a great man, and I am a poor Negro, but the Negro can tell Master Lincoln how to save the money and the young men. He can do it by setting the Negro free. Suppose that was an awful big snake down there, on the floor. He bite you. Folks all scared, because you die. You send for a doctor to cut the bite, but the snake, he rolled up there. And while the doctor doing it, he bite you again. The doctor dug out that bite, but while the doctor doing it, the snake, he spring up and bite you again, so he keep doing it, till you kill him. That's what Master Lincoln ought to know. Tubman served as a nurse in Port Royal, preparing remedies from local plants and aiding soldiers suffering from dysentery. She rendered assistance to men with smallpox. That she did not contract the disease herself started more rumors that she was blessed by God. At first, she received government rations for her work, but newly freed blacks thought she was getting special treatment. To ease the tension, she gave up her right to these supplies and made money selling pies and root beer, which she made in the evenings. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Tubman considered it an important step toward the goal of liberating all black people from slavery. She renewed her support for a defeat of the Confederacy, and in early 1863 she led a band of scouts through the land around Port Royal. The marshes and rivers in South Carolina were similar to those of the eastern shore of Maryland, thus, her knowledge of covert travel and subterfuge among potential enemies was put to good use. In the 1870s, Tubman became active in the Thompson Memorial African Methodist Episcopal, AME, Zion Church in Auburn. In 1895, she began discussions with AME Zion leaders and others to create a Harriet Tubman home for the aged that would care for indigent colored people. Despite her financial limitations, in 1896 Tubman bid $1,215 at auction for a 25-acre, 10 hectares, farm adjacent to the one she already owned, to use for the new facility. She designated one of the farm's buildings as its primary residence and named it John Brown Hall, to honor her late abolitionist ally. However, raising funds for the project was difficult, and attempts to donate the property were complicated by the multiple mortgage loans used to pay for it. After Tubman almost lost the property due to her financial difficulties, AME Zion agreed to take it over in 1903. The home did not open for another 5 years, and Tubman was dismayed when the church ordered residents to pay a $100 entrance fee, equivalent to $3,260 in 2022. She said, "Hey, make a rule that nobody should come in without they have $100. Now I wanted to make a rule that nobody should come in unless they didn't have no money at all." She was frustrated by the new rule, but was the guest of honor nonetheless when the home celebrated its opening on June 23, 1908. As Tubman aged, her childhood head trauma continued to trouble her. Unable to sleep because of pain and buzzing in her head. In the late 1890s she asked a doctor at Boston's Massachusetts General Hospital to operate. In her words, "He sawed open my skull, and raised it up, and now it feels more comfortable." She reportedly received no anesthesia and instead bit down on a bullet, as she had seen Civil War soldiers do when their limbs were amputated. By 1911, Tubman's body was so frail that she was admitted into the rest home named in her honor. A New York newspaper described her as ill and penniless, prompting supporters to offer a new round of donations. Surrounded by friends and family members, she died of pneumonia on March 10, 1913. Just before she died, she quoted the Gospel of John to those in the room, "I go away to prepare a place for you." Tubman was buried with semi-military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn. Widely known and well-respected while she was alive, Tubman became an American icon in the years after she died. A survey at the end of the 20th century named her as one of the most famous civilians in American history before the Civil War. She inspired generations of African Americans struggling for equality and civil rights. She was praised by leaders across the political spectrum. I have come to the end of this story. I'm so hoping you all enjoyed it. Till we meet again, have a blessed day or night. Sending out love to you all.